The stale air of the crypt grew heavier with each passing hour, as if the very atmosphere was thickening, suffocating. I could feel it, something unseen but palpable, creeping through the stone corridors and ancient wooden shelves. The spiritual decay that had long been whispered about in hushed tones seemed no longer confined to the pages of forbidden texts, but had begun to seep into the physical realm itself. It was during my routine inspection of the manuscripts that the first anomaly revealed itself. I had approached a set of leather-bound volumes, their spines cracked and worn from centuries of neglect. As my fingers brushed the surface of one tome, an inexplicable chill enveloped me, and my breath escaped in a visible mist despite the crypt's usual oppressive warmth. A cold spot, unnatural one, hovered in the air, like a wound in the fabric of reality. Startled, I withdrew my hand and glanced around. The flickering lamp cast long shadows that seemed to writhe, twisting at the periphery of my vision. I blinked, but the shadows lingered, as if watching, waiting. My heart quickened, a silent drumbeat echoing in the cavernous silence. Determined to maintain my composure, I returned to the manuscripts. But disaster was already unfolding. The pages of a particularly ancient codex began to curl and blacken beneath my hands. The ink, once a deep onyx, now bled like fresh wounds, forming grotesque, indecipherable shapes that pulsed faintly with an unnatural glow. I recoiled, the acrid scent of burning parchment filling my nostrils. "This isn't mere decay," I muttered under my breath. "It's corruption." As I stepped back, a low murmur rose from the shadows, a faint chanting that prickled my skin. I turned swiftly, heart pounding, but found only the empty crypt. The flickering shadows at the edges of my vision vanished like smoke, leaving behind a lingering sense of dread. Was it my mind playing tricks, or was the entity making its presence felt more aggressively? I moved cautiously deeper into the crypt, my footsteps echoing hollowly against the stone. The sulfuric temps of brimstone invaded my senses, mingling with the musty smell of old parchment and dust. It was a smell I had come to dread, an unmistakable sign of infernal presence. Tracing the crypt floor with my lantern's beam, I discovered faint sigils once drawn with holy chalk, now corrupted and glowing with a sickly iridescence. The lines that had been firm and precise were now fractured and blurred, as if the very sanctity of the warding spells was being eroded. The walls, too, bore new stains, dark, viscous streaks that seemed to pulse like veins, a grotesque mirror of spiritual rot. I sank to my knees, the weight of realization pressing down on me. The containment was failing. The entity's influence had begun to fracture the protective seals, manifesting not only in the metaphysical but as physical rot and distortion. Every shadow, every chill, every corrupted manuscript was a sign that the dark force was clawing its way to freedom. Frustration and fear warred within me. I was an archivist, a keeper of sacred knowledge, but now I was a sentinel against an encroaching darkness. The protocols I had trusted, the seals, the wards, the ancient prayers, were no longer sufficient. The spiritual decay was accelerating, and with it, the danger to the Vatican itself. I knew I had to act quickly, but how? The forbidden texts offered no guidance beyond warnings and tales of failure. I felt isolated, the weight of centuries pressing down like the stones above me. Yet, the flickering shadows beckoned, a silent challenge to my faith and resolve. As I gathered the corrupted manuscripts, I whispered a prayer, hoping that some flicker of divine light remained within these hallowed walls. The crypt was dying, and with it, the fragile barrier between salvation and damnation. Tonight, the shadows would grow bolder, and I would be forced to confront the true nature of the darkness that sought to consume us all. But even in this despair, a grim determination took root. The battle was far from over. If the physical decay was a sign, then it was also a warning and a call to arms. I would find a way to strengthen the seals, to purge the corruption, or perish trying. For the sanctity of the Church, for the souls trapped within these walls, and for my own salvation. As I extinguished my lantern and prepared to descend deeper into the crypt's bowels, a final thought echoed in my mind. The signs of corruption were not merely symptoms, they were the heralds of an approaching storm. And the Vatican would never be the same again. The weight of the crypt pressed heavily against my chest as I sat alone before the flickering screen, the only source of light in the vast, shadowed chamber. The cold descended from the vaulted ceilings like a living thing, curling around my limbs and whispering secrets I did not wish to hear. My fingers trembled as I scrolled through the latest entries of the possession log, one that should have remained sealed, yet continued to update itself, as if the entity within was reaching out through the digital veil. Each new line of text etched horrors into my mind. Descriptions of convulsions, guttural voices speaking in tongues unknown, and ominous notations scribbled in margins that seemed less human and more eldritch. I rubbed my temples, desperate to dispel the mounting headache that throbbed like a persistent drumbeat. The spiritual decay that had first whispered at the edges of my perception now clawed openly at my sanity. Father Matteo, a soft voice interrupted my spiral of despair. Sister Helena's presence was a bomb, her eyes reflecting a mixture of concern and quiet strength as she knelt beside me. "You've not slept in days. You must rest, or you will not withstand what is to come." I shook my head, trying to dismiss the fatigue that threatened to drag me under. "I cannot rest while this thing moves unchecked. The logit's changing, faster now. There's a breach imminent." Her fingers brushed my arm gently. "We are here for you. You need not carry this burden alone." Her words, though kind, barely anchored me. The crypt's oppressive silence seemed to close in tighter with every passing moment. The next day, compelled by a mixture of dread and necessity, I sought out Cardinal Lorenzo Vieri. The secretive order to which he belonged rarely revealed itself to outsiders, but my discoveries had forced my hand. The corridors leading to his chamber were labyrinthian, lined with frescoes whose saints gazed down with eyes that seemed simultaneously compassionate and accusing. Cardinal Vieri awaited me in a dimly lit room, the air thick with incense and unspoken fear. His gaze bore into me like a blade. "You have seen what should not be seen," he said quietly. "The entity within that log is unlike any we have contained before. It is not merely a demon, but a fracture in the divine order itself." A chill ran down my spine. What happens if the breach is not contained? He sighed deeply, the lines on his face deepening. The sanctity of the Vatican, of the Church, even the very fabric of faith, would be at risk. The darkness would spread beyond this crypt, corrupting all it touches. I swallowed hard. Then what must I do? "You are burdened with a sacred task," he intoned. "But be warned, the path ahead will test your faith, your sanity, and your soul." As I left his chamber, the weight of his words settled over me like a shroud. Back in the crypt, the possession log awaited. Its screen glowed eerily in the darkness, the latest update appearing before my eyes. Containment weakening. Threshold nearing collapse. I felt the walls close in, the shadows stretching longer, darker. The entity was on the cusp of release, and I, Father Matteo Ricci, exorcist archivist, was the reluctant guardian standing against an unfathomable divine horror. I could feel it watching me, waiting for the moment the seal would break. And in that moment, I would have to confront not only the darkness without, but the darkness within. The battle was no longer a question of if, but when. and time was running out. The air in the crypt was colder than usual, a biting chill that clawed at my skin and settled deep in my bones. I stood before the ancient oak desk, its surface scarred by centuries of ink and prayer, where the flickering glow of the laptop screen seemed almost out of place. Brother Luca, ever steady, adjusted the small array of relics arrayed around Uster crucifix, a vial of holy water, and an ancient engraved medallion. Their presence was a fragile tether between the ethereal and the digital, a precarious bridge we hoped would hold. Father Luca's voice was calm but betrayed a hint of unease. "Are you sure this will work? A digital exorcism. It's unprecedented." I swallowed hard, the weight of my own doubts pressing down like the centuries of spiritual battles etched into these crypt walls. "We have no choice. The entity is evolving, its influence seeping into the very data. If we delay any longer, the containment will fail entirely." The faint hum of the laptop was suddenly overwhelmed by a low, guttural whisper that seemed to emanate not just from the speakers, but from the stones themselves. As I initiated the program, the screen flickered violently, and the case file began to update before my eyes, lines of text bleeding like ink into water, symbols twisting into shapes that defied comprehension. A cold wind swept through the chamber, snuffing out the candles and stirring the ancient dust. Shadows convulsed along the crypt's walls, crawling like living things. Brother Luca's fingers trembled as he steadied the keyboard. "The entity is resisting," he murmured. I nodded, gripping the crucifix tighter. "Hold steady, we must push through." The whispers morphed into a cacophony of anguished cries and distorted prayers, a choir of torment that clawed at the edges of my mind. My vision blurred, and for a moment, the crypt itself seemed to dissolve, replaced by a boundless void punctuated by flashes of divine light and shadow. Suddenly, the laptop emitted a piercing shriek, and the screen exploded into a swirl of spectral light. In that blinding moment, I glimpsed the entity's true form, a terrifying amalgamation of divine horror and spiritual decay. It was a shifting mass of corruption, both radiant and grotesque, a manifestation of all that the sacred and the profane could conjure. "Father," Luca's voice cut through the chaos, grounding me back in the crypt. I forced myself to breathe, to focus. The entity recoiled, retreating into the digital depths from which it had surged. The whispers faded, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed against my ear. Exhausted, I sank to my knees beside the ancient texts, the weight of what we had unleashed settling like a stone in my chest. The crypt was still, but I knew this fragile calm was only temporary. The spiritual decay had been laid bare, and the battle was far from over. "We've broken the seal," I whispered, voice barely audible, but at what cost? Brother Luca placed a steady hand on my shoulder, his eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight. "We fight on, Father. Whatever comes next, we fight." As I looked back at the laptop screen, now dark and silent, a cold certainty settled within me. This was only the beginning. The forbidden texts had warned us of such reckoning, and now, the crypt itself had become a battleground where the sacred and the profane clashed in a war without end. I rose slowly, steeling myself against the shadows that still lingered, and prepared to face whatever darkness dared to rise next. The moment the containment seal fractured, a cold wave swept through the crypt, thickening the air with palpable malice. Father Matteo stood frozen, eyes wide as the impossible began to take shape before him. Shadows writhed unnaturally, coalescing into a form both terrifying and incomprehensibly shifting silhouette, woven from darkness and flickering holy light, a grotesque parody of sanctity. The entity's voice was a cacophony of whispers and screams, echoing inside the stone chamber, clawing at Matteo's mind with every syllable. He reached instinctively for his crucifix, the cold metal a fragile anchor against the storm threatening to consume him. The walls around him seemed to breathe, ancient symbols etched into the stone, glowing and pulsing with a sickly light. The ground beneath his feet throbbed rhythmically, as if the crypt itself were alive, a vessel for this blasphemous presence. Candles flickered wildly, their flames twisting into shapes that resembled anguished faces. Their silent screams a mirror to the torment unraveling in the chamber. "In Namen Patrice," Matteo whispered, voice trembling but steadying. The words were a lifeline, a fragile barrier between him and the encroaching darkness. The entity responded with a guttural roar, tendrils of shadow lashing out like living serpents. They struck at him, invisible but gut-wrenching, each contact a searing test of his faith. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he pressed the crucifix closer, chanting with increasing fervor, invoking the ancient rites he had studied for years, but never imagined wielding in such a raw battle for his soul. Reality warped around him. Stone walls rippled like water. Sacred scripts burned and bled ink onto the floor. The air was thick with the stench of decay and something far worse, an intangible corruption that clawed at the edges of his sanity. Yet amidst the chaos, a new presence emerged, Brother Lucian, stepping through the shifting shadows with a calm that seemed almost unearthly. His voice was steady, offering counsel and arcane knowledge, a beacon of hope in the maelstrom. "Father Matteo," Lucian said quietly, "the entity feeds on fear and doubt. Hold fast, the sacred and profane are locked in battle here, but we still possess weapons beyond the physical." Together, they wove an intricate ritual, blending ancient rites with the digital tools Matteo had painstakingly developed. The crypt became a crucible of light and shadow, each incantation pushing back the entity's form, forcing it to retreat into the cracks of reality it had torn open. But the victory was tenuous. The air remained charged with spiritual decay, a reminder that containment was not permanent. As the first hints of dawn filtered through the crypt's narrow vents, Matteo sank to his knees, breath ragged, body trembling. The entity had been repelled, but not banished. The cost was etched into the very stones around him, the scars of a battle fought on the edge of faith and madness. He knew this was only the beginning. The divine horror had been unleashed, and the war for the sanctity of the Vatican had just erupted. In the silence that followed, Matteo's thoughts churned with questions and fears. Could his faith, his knowledge, and his will be enough to hold back a force that bent reality and defied the sacred boundaries? Or was the crypt now a tomb, not just for the Church's secrets, but for the very light it sought to preserve? The echoes of the entity's voice lingered long after the darkness receded, a chilling reminder that some horrors were not meant to be contained, only endured. And as Father Matteo rose, his resolve hardened not by certainty, but by the unyielding need to confront the darkness, whatever the cost. The crypt was suffused with an almost tangible tension as I prepared for the ritual that would either redeem my soul or damn it irrevocably. The flicker of candlelight cast long shadows across the cold stone walls, flickering over the elaborate sigils and protective glyphs freshly etched into the floor around me. Each mark was a prayer, a plea to powers both divine and mysterious, drawn with trembling hands, yet unwavering conviction. The air itself seemed charged, thick with the mingling sense of burning incense and the sterile hum of the digital devices arrayed around the chamber. Brother Elias stood beside me, his gaunt face illuminated by the soft glow of the hollow projectors that traced lines of sacred text into the air. His voice rose steadily in a solemn Latin chant, a litany of ancient power that had echoed through the ages within these hallowed halls. Despite the weight of years etched into his features, there was a spark of fierce hope in his eyes, a hope I desperately tried to share. "Remember, Father Matteo," he intoned gravely, "this is not merely a battle of flesh and spirit, but of knowledge and faith intertwined. The entity feeds on doubt and decay. Hold fast." I nodded, gripping the relic in my hands, an ancient crucifix fused with a custom scanner, designed to detect and disrupt the entity's ethereal influence. It was a symbol of the old world meeting the new, sacred and technological fused into a fragile weapon against the darkness. As the chant swelled, the holoprojectors cast protective barriers of shimmering light, encasing the chamber in a cage of both faith and circuitry. Suddenly, a surge of icy darkness erupted from the shadows at the periphery of our circle. The entity manifested partially, its form shifting like smoke, yet burning with an unearthly white light that seared the senses. The temperature plummeted, and a wind howled through the crypt despite its sealed confines. I felt the weight of its gaze, an oppressive force that sought to unravel my very soul. "Hold the line," Elias shouted, his voice cracking but resolute. I tightened my grip on the relic, feeling its warmth pulse faintly as the scanner beeped erratically. With every incantation, every line of code we executed, the entity recoiled, howling in a voice that was at once both human agony and cosmic wrath. The crypt trembled as light and shadow waged war, the air thick with the clash of spiritual energies beyond human comprehension. Pain lanced through me, visions of decay, lost souls, and endless torment flashed behind my eyelids. I fought to steady my breath, to anchor myself in faith and duty. This was no longer a mere containment. It was a crucible, a test of everything I believed in. Minutes, or perhaps hours, passed in a blur of chanting and coded prayers until, finally, an eerie silence settled. The oppressive cold lifted marginally, and the shadows retreated into the dark corners of the crypt. The holoprojectors dimmed, and Brother Elias lowered his voice. "It is done, for now, but the scars remain." Exhausted, I sank to my knees, the weight of the ritual pressing down on me like a physical burden. The crypt was scarred, glyphs faded in places, and the air still carried the residue of spiritual warfare. Yet the entity was contained once more, its malevolent influence held at bay by this fragile new covenant of ancient rites and modern science. As I looked around the chamber, the heavy silence was punctuated only by the soft beep of the scanner and our labored breathing. I knew this was but a temporary reprieve. The battle between light and darkness was eternal, and the cost of this victory was etched deeply into my soul. But for now, I had fulfilled my duty. The possession logs would be updated, sealed anew, and the forbidden texts would stand as grim reminders of the price we paid. The crypt, though battered, remained a sanctuary, a fragile fortress against the encroaching void. Yet, in the depths of my heart, a question lingered. Was this truly the end, or merely the opening chapter of a darker covenant yet to come? The shadows seemed to whisper, and I knew the war was far from over. The iron door groaned a reluctant welcome as I pushed it open, stepping into the oppressive stillness of the crypt beneath the Vatican archives. The air was thick, laden with centuries of dust, the faint scent of candle wax mingling with something far more unsettling, an intangible hint of rot, as if the very spirit of this place had begun to decay. Brother Anselmo's trembling hand lingered on the doorframe, his eyes clouded with a mixture of fear and reverence. "Few come here," he murmured, voice barely above a whisper. "Fewer still return unchanged." I swallowed the rising unease that threatened to unsettle my purpose. As an exorcist archivist, my calling was clear: to preserve, to understand, to confront the darkness hidden within these walls. The crypt stretched before me like a cavernous tomb, its stone shelves groaning under the weight of ancient tomes, their leather bindings cracked and faded. Each book seemed to pulse with a silent history, whispering secrets of spiritual battles fought and won or lost long ago. With careful hands, I began the digitization process, the scanner's soft hum the only sound breaking the suffocating silence. My fingers trembled slightly as I lifted the first sealed possession log, its parchment fragile beneath my touch. The log was a record of possession cases, meticulously chronicled but forbidden, sealed away from the eyes of the uninitiated. Yet here I was, entrusted with breathing new life into these shadowed histories. The candlelight flickered, casting grotesque shadows on the crypt's ancient walls. Faces carved into the stone seemed to warp and twist in the wavering glow, their silent screams etched eternally in stone. A shiver ran down my spine, the shadows reaching out like tendrils of darkness seeking to snatch away my resolve. As I settled into my work, a sudden chill swept through the crypt, an unnatural cold that seeped into my bones. The scanner's light caught on a particularly worn text, and for a moment I thought I heard a faint murmur, a whisper so slight it could have been the wind or something else. My breath hitched, but I forced myself to continue. This was no place for fear. This was a sacred duty. Hours passed like minutes as I catalogued each log, the weight of their histories pressing down on me. I felt the spiritual decay closing in, a slow rot eating away at the sanctity of this place. The possession logs were more than records. They were battlegrounds frozen in time, warnings etched in ink and blood. As dawn approached, I paused, my eyes drawn to the sealed entries, their locks etched with holy symbols designed to contain horrors beyond comprehension. I could not yet know the darkness that stirred within, waiting. Yet, beneath the sacred halls of the Vatican, I had begun a journey from which there was no return.